And I've always found that very unfair. I've been told many times when, for example, I raise my voice a little bit, "Oh, what a princess you are, huh?" You know, jokingly saying that I'm not this sort of princess. Which is terribly misogynistic in my opinion. But in any case, that's not what a girl is. That's just what a girl society thinks should be. That's not what a girl actually is. That's not what a gender actually means. To me, gender is not a real thing. I think it's not real. How do you define it? I think that personally, we just have a set of emotions, of values, of experiences, of feelings that we can't give a name to. And so we put them in a box. And we find that there are maybe people who have similar boxes or similar feelings inside of them. And so you just kind of give it that label that these other peoples also use. It still doesn't make a lot of sense, but maybe it can if we consider the fact that we do that with a lot of other things. For example, mental conditions, and I don't mean disorders, but rather ways in which different people function, for example, autism. Which doctor can really understand when someone is just as autistic enough to have a diagnosis for the spectrum disorder? When does he decide that that's the right amount of sensibility or attachment to a routine or fixation that autistic people should have in order to have a diagnosis? It's a little bit subjective when it comes to the doctor itself. And it all comes from the mere fact that when people are autistic, just have a set of personal ways in which they work, feel, or speak that we have decided to put in this autism box. And I'm not saying that gender is an illness or a way that the mind works. That's not it at all. It's just an example of how we tend to group things together because we can't stand to have feelings just roaming through our minds without giving them a name. And I do think that gender isn't real because all this label that we give to this box of feelings is not real. We just made it up. But why did we decide that it's male or female? So that we could keep our female and male roles efficiently. We have convinced ourselves that gender is a real thing, and we desperately search inside of ourselves some sort of feelings, values, whatever, that can be associated with gender, so that we as a society can keep up with what we have made gender to be. And still, why am I a girl if so many of how my mind works is so masculine? Why do I still identify as a girl? Maybe because I'm so, affected by my physical condition, which is female. And therefore, I just automatically assume that I'm a girl. But what does it mean to be a girl? The only reason why I think I'm a girl is the fact that I think gender doesn't exist. And it's much easier to just say my gender is girl because I am physically a girl. It's easier, but when someone asks, I've never been asked what's your gender, but if someone talks about gender, it's really hard to say it's not real, in my opinion. Naturally, if you have a different opinion, feel free to write it down below. I'm not a fan of people disagreeing with me, but I can try. So, about transgender people, they never think about the fact that gender isn't real, or at least not enough people talk about this. And I understand why they're transgender, because gender is so abstract and absurd and completely useless. Then naturally think, why am I supposed to have the gender you told me that I am when gender is such, meaningless stuff? I will change my gender, the gender that you gave me, because it's so absurd. But what does it mean to change it to another one? Isn't it just as absurd? In my opinion, yes. I don't think there's any use in changing your gender. I think society actually pushed us into changing our gender because they make gender so oppressive, and so it makes me choke sometimes. You know how bad I felt when I realized that I was masculine. I'm not feminine, I'm not a girl, but being a girl doesn't mean anything. But at some point I could have said, okay, fine, if God wants me to be so masculine, then I'll be a man already. Which is what I've thought sometimes. I mean, sometimes I've thought, if I had to be so masculine, then make me a man at this point. If I had to have these wide shoulders and hair and whatever else, just make me a man at this point. Doesn't take much. I'm basically a man already. I just need the private parts. And you know, when I've been thinking about this sort of stuff, I've been just thinking about the fact that it is society that actually pushes us into challenging our gender. Being transgender was never anti-conformity to society. It was always what society was doomed to, come to. And I'm not saying doomed to as in transgender people are somehow a bad thing, but that they very often experience a lot of suffering because of this realization that their gender doesn't feel like that it's yours, so that it doesn't align with what they really are. And I know, not because I'm transgender, because I felt the opposite way. I was so convinced that I was so boyish, but I really wanted to be a girl, but I realized kind of it doesn't matter. I still suffer, especially for the physical thing, because that's clearly unattractive. But I suffer a little bit less when it comes to how I am as a person, mentally. Because I realized that gender is not a real thing. So it made me feel a little bit better. So should trans people stop being trans? No, of course not. I have no right to say that. Do I think that more people should be familiar with the idea that gender doesn't exist so that they feel better? Everyone would feel better if we just agree that it's not a real thing. Also, from a cis point of view, we should, completely refuse all of the gender roles. And this includes thinking that gender is a real thing. Because if we say that gender is real, but it's not the social norms, because we should abolish the social norms related to gender, and it's also not the sex, then what is it? Like, what's left? All we have about gender is the roles, like societal rules that a specific gender should, follow, and biological sex. So if we refuse both of them, what's left for gender? There's nothing left. Gender, it's not there anymore, and that's a good thing. We should all realize that gender isn't a real thing. And if you can't, if you're so fixated on gender, that's fine. Be transgender, be cisgender, I don't care. But I think it's so much better for the mind to realize that gender isn't a real thing. It would be better for everyone, even cis women, cis men, or cis people, because I don't think women and men have any sort of difference outside of their sex and their societal norms that I think should be definitely abolished. And that's just one way in which, I don't remember exactly the quote, but Marx said something really similar to this. I didn't read this in a Marx book. It was in Engels' Origin of the Family, a really good book, by the way, you should read it, in which Marx was quoted, and he said that something along the lines of man. I'm sorry. The fact that man names things, ultimately, it's a way to exercise power. I don't know if exercise power is an expression that exists in English. I'm sorry, but use power was a little bit lame. When we name stuff, we are so powerful over it, and that's what gender is, in my opinion. We give a name to people. We put people into boxes so that it's easier to give them certain roles and systematically oppress them, as gender, but also as class, naturally. If we stay in the topic of Engels, I think that's much easier when we actually give a name to the gender. And for example, this is also what Michel Foucault said. Sadly, I only know his philosophical terms in my mother tongue. I'm really sorry about that. but vaguely without his actual terms. What he said is that when you have to fight something, or when you have to use your power on something, first you need to know it. You need to know it all around, and knowledge is power, and knowledge is violent power. And by knowledge, I also mean what it is. And if it isn't nothing, just pretend that it is. Give it a name and pretend it's something. That's exactly why we give different names, for example, different legislations or different laws. I don't think there's any moral distinction between, for example, zoophilia, bestiality, I would rather say, and eating an animal. You're still brutally violating that animal's rights to not suffer just because you want some pleasure. When you eat good meat, you just do it for the pleasure usually. You don't need that much meat. Nobody needs as much meat that we produce. Nobody does. And actually nobody needs meat at all. It's been scientifically proven. Nobody needs meat. But we still kill animals, and we torture them. And we kill them, and then we brutally butcher them, and we eat them for like 5 minutes or even less, and we're just like happy that we tasted something good. What's the difference with that and, raping an animal? Both of these are disgusting. We're just, as a society, we're more like disgusted by rape, and that's probably a topic I want to talk about, but not now, than death itself. But I don't think that torturing and killing an animal is like morally better than raping one. We just give it different names, like bestiality, whatever it's, however it's pronounced. And then like, oh, it's just the meat industry. Which is like just another way of, bestiality, like killing an animal, torturing an animal. And I don't know how many animals get raped in the meat industry, but I would say that it's more than one a day. I don't know why I made that stat up, but I just thought about it for a little. So we give different names to things so that we have better, control over stuff, so that life is better for us. And that also includes gender, because it's easier to give people roles and oppress them if you give them, you put them in boxes, say you have to do this, you have to do that, but actually you don't belong to that box, you've been lied to. And that's what society does to gender. But what you personally does to gender, I've already, talked about this, is just like wrap it up. The fact that we feel these sort of things, and we think that it would be better for us if we pretended that we are relating to a certain set of people, set a box of people, for example, girls or boys. And it's so easier to like do that than a lot of other things, because girls and boys are so often talked about, so like just put yourself in that box rather than like, I don't know, whatever else. And so I don't think gender is real, and I feel a lot of like empathy to transgender people who then change their sex or go through hormone therapy or whatever to feel better in their bodies. I think that's perfectly valid, because it doesn't have to necessarily be about your gender. I know that gender doesn't exist. I know that some people think it does, and I'm probably never going to change that fact. Some people some people just do think that gender is real, and they're going to do that, and they're totally free to do so. And also, I believe that many people go through hormone therapy or like surgeries even though they're cis. For example, I would like to like be more feminine. I don't know if hormones would help me. I'm not really that knowledgeable in that, topic. But if it did, I would probably like to, consider doing it, even though I probably wouldn't, but still. And also, surgery, if someone has, for example, if a woman has a very large chest, she should be allowed to, reduce it, even though she's, like cis. Because she's more comfortable in her body that way, even though it doesn't necessarily have to hurt her back. Still, even if it doesn't, she should have the right to, and that's the same thing for transgender people. So thank you for watching. Those were my 2 videos on gender. The first one was an introduction. This is actually my point. I actually have a lot more arguments about this, and I've been meaning to write an essay about this, but I've been very bored and not productive at all, so this is all you get. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any other thoughts, please write them in the comments. Be polite to me, please. If you know any literature that either agrees with me or corroborates me, then please share it too. And thank you for watching. Consider subscribing. Bye.